Hi guys, it's your science teacher here with another video. This time it's all on B5 communicable diseases, perhaps one of my favourite topics in the biology syllabus, so hopefully you enjoy this video. Disease can be split up into two main categories, communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. Communicable diseases are characterised by the fact that they can be passed on. And that means that there must be a pathogen involved. And there's three types of pathogens you need to know about quite well, and they are fungi, you need to know about virus, and you need to know about bacteria. There is a little bit on protists as well, so we'll put that on the list as well. But all of these are categorized into one thing called a pathogen. And these can all be spread, but how does a disease spread? Well, it can be from a few things. You can have diseases that spread by direct contact, such as diseases like STIs, gonorrhea, where you are in direct contact with the person. However, it doesn't always have to be direct contact. Sometimes diseases can travel by air. Think about the flu. If you sneeze in the air, then water particles travel through the air carrying some of that virus or bacteria. And the last way that it can travel is by water. And there is some diseases that can travel by water. Diseases like cholera that you get from drinking dirty water, they're travelled by water. Now, there is other factors that can affect our health. We know that. We can be more susceptible to viral or bacterial diseases. If, for example, you are malnourished, meaning you do not get enough food, that will massively affect your immune system. That will make your immune system worse. And therefore, you won't be able to fight off as many communicable diseases. And also, some of it is genetics. Genetically, you might not have the best immune system to fight off infection. Also, the place where you live, where you're from, some diseases are completely wiped out in some areas of the world. However, they're really prevalent in some places. For example, you're unlikely to get malaria if you live in Europe because of the fact there's not as many mosquitoes carrying the malaria parasite. However, if you were to live in Africa, you are more likely to get that disease. So where you live also can have massive effects on your health. We're going to look at in a bit more detail at bacteria and viruses now. And I've got a couple of pictures up here of some bacteria and some viral infections. Here we have viruses on the right, and I have bacteria here over on the left-hand side. And there's some key differences. You can probably spot some already. The viruses are often quite strange shapes. And there's a reason for their strange shape. It's so that they can infect cells. They actually are incredibly small, and they go into your cells. And they don't reproduce by themselves. What happens is, once they are inside the cell, they will reproduce when your cell divides. So they need cell division in order to be effective. Because of the fact that viruses live inside cells, they're incredibly hard to treat. Often you will not get prescribed antibiotics because antibiotics do not work against viral infections because you're not actually trying to kill the cells. Often if you've got a viral infection, you will be prescribed things like painkillers in order to basically make your disease a little bit more pleasant whilst you have the infection. And over time, hopefully, your body develops antibodies in order to fight the virus. We know quite a few examples of viruses, things like the flu, HIV, and measles. They're all examples of viral diseases. Bacteria, on the other hand, are a lot larger than viruses. That's because they don't actually infect your cells, and they can reproduce by themselves. They reproduce rapidly, and they become colonies called herds of bacteria And to treat a bacterial infection, what you'd usually take is antibiotics, and that would usually kill the bacteria. It also kills some good bacteria as well. However, it often kills bad bacteria. So bacterial infections are more likely to be treated by antibiotics. Some examples of bacterial infections are gonorrhea, and you also have salmonella. Now, there is some things that fall into the category of both bacteria and viruses. They have similarities. The main similarities are how they make you feel ill. What they do is, when they're inside the body, they produce these things called toxins, and the toxins are what make you feel so bad and ill whilst you've got the infection. Also, they can be spread in similar ways. Lots of them are spread through the air and also through contact. You can make your own culture of bacteria in a science lab. You probably did this at school with your teacher. The most important thing to remember, though, is sterilization is the key, and sterilization will kill off all the unwanted bacteria. So then you are only making the bacteria that you really want. So it's massively key. And the way you can sterilize is using a Bunsen burner. Bunsen burners get to incredible heat. So if you use your Bunsen burner and dip into the rod that you're going to be using to transfer the bacteria you want to grow, then you'll kill off all the other bacteria that is on that rod before. Also, to keep the lid of the Petri dish down, you need to remember to do that so you're not introducing other bacteria from the outside. So the lid of the Petri dish is massively important to keep it sterile. The gel that you use, you might need to remember that, is called agar gel. And that's what you use to grow your bacteria in. And you can see here, I've got a few colonies of bacteria growing. And you can look under a microscope and you'll be able to see the bacteria quite clearly that you've made. When scientists create harmful bacteria pathogens in a lab, they have to be incredibly careful that they don't create mutations of that bacteria. Because if a mutated gene comes out, maybe it could be resistant to antibiotic. So they've got to be incredibly careful and take lots of safety precautions when using these Petri dishes. They need to make sure that once they've grown the bacteria, that they dispose of it in a very safe manner. Bacteria reproduce really rapidly, and you can actually use an equation to work out how many bacteria you're going to have at the end of a period if you know how many bacteria you had at the start and how quickly it takes for that bacteria to divide. For example, if a bacteria divides every 30 minutes, and there were 40 bacteria to begin with, and 6 hours have passed, I could work out how many bacteria I'm going to have at the end, because every 30 minutes, they're going to divide in 2. And I can use this equation to work out how many I'm going to have at the end. So let's use this equation then. So if there's 6 hours have passed and it divides every 30 minutes, I've had a total of 12 divisions in that time. So there's been 12 complete divisions, and there were 40 at the start, I said. So I'd have to do 40 times by 2 to the power 12. And that will give me how many bacteria I will have at my end. That actually equals 163,840. So that shows you that you don't need a long time to end up with a vast amount of bacteria. So that just shows you how quickly these bacteria divide. And the importance of this equation, you might be asked to use this in the exam, so you might have to remember to apply this equation. We're going to now look at some bacterial infections in depth. The first one is salmonella, a very common bacterial infection that comes from mainly raw meat and raw eggs. Now, it's thought that worldwide around 2.2 million people die from bacterial infections such as salmonella that you get from eating raw meat and raw eggs. Now, in the UK, to prevent salmonella, the chickens and poultry are injected with a vaccine that stops the salmonella. Common symptoms of salmonella include sickness and diarrhea. Although bacterial infections in plants are rare, they still do occur. Bacterial infections in plants often cause these kind of abscesses on the plant called galls. They're often seen in fruit trees, and they can have negative effects on the plant. But scientists are actually using this bacterial infection in order to genetically modify plants. What they do is often these cells that are present in the galls are undifferentiated. And for this reason, these bacteria become a key tool for scientists when genetically modifying plants. Scientists make use of the way the bacteria naturally infect plant cells and give them new added genes. They manipulate the bacteria so they can carry desirable genes. So it just causes desirable genes in GM plants. Diseases by viral infection are a lot more common in plants. And here is an example of a viral infection in plants. This is called tobacco mosaic virus. And the reason why it got that name is because it typically infected tobacco plants. However, it does, in fact, infect 150 different plant species, including tomato plants. And it causes this distinct mosaic pattern and discoloration on the leaves as the virus destroys the cells. Because of the fact it's destroying cells, it causes stunted growth in the plant, and it affects the leaves. And obviously the leaves is where photosynthesis occurs, and if the leaves fail, then the plant cannot grow as effectively. For a farmer, it can be incredibly bad because it can destroy your crops, and it can really decrease the yield of crop. There is no treatment, and farmers now grow tobacco mosaic virus-free genetically modified plants in order to try and prevent it. So the way that they're getting around it is by genetically modifying plants. Also, if a plant does become infected, they will try and cut off the part of the plant that's infected to reduce the spread of it. But another massive problem with this is, in fact, it can stay around for 50 years in the soil, the tobacco mosaic virus. It survives really well. As we know, viruses can infect people as well, and we talked about two of them. We talked about HIV and measles as two massive viral diseases. And here's a picture of someone that has measles, in fact. Measles characterized by having itchy spots. But measles can also be fatal in elderly people, and it can also cause death to people who are really young and have poor immune systems as well. It's almost been eradicated completely in the UK because of the fact there is a jab that you can take for it. There's an MMR jab, and this means that some people are immune to the measles virus. However, there has been isolated incidents where there has been mini measles outbreaks in the UK because of the fact people are not vaccinating their children anymore. Pretty sobering figure, though, is that still 145,000 people die globally due to the measles virus. And this number could be significantly lower if they were just to take this vaccine in other countries. Fungal infections are a lot less common in people, and there is only a few, but let's look at one here. That's athlete's foot. And like in its name, it's found a lot in sports people because of the high temperatures and sweat. in their shoes, it's perfect conditions for fungi to grow. So they need moisture to grow, and often they find that in sports people's footwear. It's not that hard to treat a fungi. That's why we don't see a lot of deaths from fungal diseases in people. You can just use antifungal cream. On the rare occasion that you get a fungal infection inside the body, that's when they're more difficult to treat. Sometimes these conditions do happen in things like damaged heart valves. If they become open, sometimes then you can get fungus inside them, and they can be very difficult to treat. Fungal infections, however, are a lot more common in plants. And over here we have a fungal infection called rose black spot, a very common infection for a lot of plants. You've probably actually seen that in plants that are growing in your garden. The leaves often turn yellow, and it weakens the leaves turn yellow, and it weakens the area for photosynthesis. So it reduces in stunted growth, and the flowers often don't grow as well on a plant with rose black spot. That's why it's called rose black spot, in fact, because it's often found on rose plants, and obviously roses, we want to look lovely. So for a farmer who's growing roses, if he's got rose black spot on his leaves, that is not a good sign. Now, in order to reduce the spread of rose black spot, often chemical fungicides are used, but sometimes it can be as simple as just chopping off infected leaves. But the way it spreads is the spores are travelled in the air from the fungus, so it can travel for miles and miles and infect many other leaves. The least common form of infection are protists, which are basically parasites. Often they're carried by a vector. A vector is something that transfers the parasite indirectly. For example, malaria is a protist, and it's carried by mosquitoes. So the mosquito is the vector, and the mosquito doesn't actually contain, the parasite. It's what is inside the mosquito that will infect you. The mosquito carries this parasite known as malaria, and the malaria is what infects you, and it's incredibly deadly. Malaria is. The parasite travels down into the human bloodstream and travels all around the human body in the circulatory system. They affect mainly the liver and damage the red blood cells. Malaria causes recurrent episodes of fever and shaking, and it can be fatal. And it also weakens the affected person over time, even if it doesn't kill them. Globally, unfortunately, 660,000 people die annually due to malaria, and it can be treated. So there are treatments for malaria. If diagnosed early, you can treat it. And also, the main strategy is prevention with things like mosquito nets, and also having jabs in order to prevent you from catching malaria in the first place. So we've had a look at some of the infections now. We've looked at viral, bacterial and fungal diseases. Let's look how we can control them. The first way is hygiene. Hygiene's had a massive effect on reducing the spread of diseases, especially in hospitals. If you walk around a hospital, you have likely seen hand sanitizers, and you'll have also seen that there's different bins for the different objects. For example, if it's touched blood or if it's touched mucus, it will go in a safe disposal bin. Also, government measures. Think about just the coronavirus, which we have experienced. The fact that the government introduced a 2-meter rule. The 2-meter rule meant that people weren't coming into contact as much. This therefore stopped the spread of the disease. As when you coughed, you weren't directly coughing straight into someone. We also reduce the spread of a disease by vaccinations. We're going to look at vaccinations in more detail in the next topic. However, it is important to remember vaccinations can give us something called herd immunity, which basically means that so much of the population has immunity to a disease that it can basically wipe it out. Think of smallpox as an example. That used to be an incredibly infectious disease that wiped out a lot of the population. However, now it's almost totally eradicated due to vaccinations. Isolation is another way to reduce the spread of disease. If you have a disease, making sure you are isolated so you cannot pass on that disease is vitally important. Just think about the track and trace method used for COVID, making sure that people were isolated and making sure people weren't exposed to that disease even more. If we do become infected with a disease, what happens with our body is we have something called our immune system, which is a host defense system comprising of many biological structures and processes that help us protect against certain diseases. For example, our immune system starts off with the largest organ in our body, our skin. Our skin is a fantastic defense system. It means that viruses and bacteria can't directly enter our bloodstream. Saliva and mucus is another good defense system that we've got as well. Basically, we have cilia cells, and the cilia wafts away dust and viruses that get into our airways and will dispose of them and make sure they do not reach our lungs. The fact our stomach as well is at such a low pH, that kills a lot of bad bacteria just because of the fact that the bacteria cannot survive in such low pHs. If there is a stronghold of a virus or bacteria in your body, then that's when our white blood cells come into play. And our white blood cells are basically comprised of two main features. We have our lymphocyte white blood cells and we have our phagocyte white blood cells. And we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail now. The lymphocytes, what they do is they basically are like the police of our body. When there is a foreign object detected, they will rush to the scene of the crime and they produce antibodies specific to the virus that has infected you or bacteria that's infected you, and they also produce antitoxins as well. And what these antibodies and antitoxins do is they bind onto either the toxin or the antigen of the virus or bacteria. Antibodies attack the antigens, and obviously antitoxins attack the toxins. And the toxins are specific shape, and so are the antigens. So here I have a pathogen, and this pathogen has on it antigens, okay? And what actually the lymphocytes will do is the lymphocytes will produce exactly perfect antibodies that will act on those antigens, okay? And they will render the virus or bacteria useless and actually kill them. Now, once those viruses are killed, they need to be disposed of, and that's where the phagocytes come in. And what phagocytes do is they engulf bad bacteria and also cells that have been infected by virus as well. And that's, you can see phagocytes actually in the body. When you get a spot on your face, that is the phagocytes that have died, okay? Phagocytes, once they've engulfed something, they die and they form like pus, and you can see phagocytes at work. If you are a combined science student, well done, you've made it to the end of the video. pat yourself on the back. But if you're a triple science student, you've only got a little bit of the topic left remaining, and we're going to look at plant defences now. Plants' defences have actually been found to be more complex than what were recent thought. In fact, some plants produce chemical barriers very similar to antibiotics, which will kill bacteria and pathogens trying to enter. As well as chemical barriers, they also have some physical barriers as well. Think about that waxy cuticle layer that's hard for microorganisms to break through, such as bacteria, and also the cellulose layer that's also hard to break through. But it doesn't just have to defend itself against pathogens. A lot of the time, plants don't. They've also got to protect themselves from herbivores, and they can do this by a few ways. They can be poisonous, and that will stop them from being eaten. They can also be spiky. That will definitely stop them from getting. Some of them are very clever and will actually curl up from the touch so that they cannot get to the juicy parts of the plant. And some of the plants actually will decolorize in order to look like it's been infected by something, and kind of mimic the fact that it's had an infection when it hasn't, so that it doesn't get eaten. As well as protecting itself from herbivores and pathogens, you can also get mineral deficiencies that happen in plants as well. That's why farmers use fertilizers on their plants to make sure that all the minerals are going to it, because if it does have a mineral deficiency, often the growth is incredibly stunted, and a lot of the time the leaves decolorize. So it's important that the plant gets all the minerals that it needs.